I am here with Brady Hunsaker, a YA fantasy author with 5 books published, creating fast-paced, easy-reading fantasy books with plenty of twists. I feel like saying that they're easy reading is kind of downplaying them, but I get what you're saying. They're a fun read, they are easy read, but they're good books with great world building. Thank you for stopping by, Brady.
Yeah.
I found you through your book, The Scorned Prince, which was your debut novel, and I was wondering, most authors have cool stories to why they started writing. Why did you start writing The Scorned Prince? What gave you the idea for the Ring Dweller world?
Well, it's actually like the 4th book I've written. Even though it's my debut, I wrote a lot of stuff before that. But I had ideas for this one kicking around for quite a while. I have like an idea log where I keep all of my different concepts in mind. And then when it comes to like me creating a new story, I just mash a bunch of ideas together until I get super hyped up about it. And then just go into like really in-depth world building. And some of the main things that were creating some inspiration for me were things like the character arc of Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then another thing had to do with just some science stuff. I love to read things about like different science because that kind of inspires like how I can make twists on them for fantasy. And one of them just has to do with how the moon is tidally locked to Earth, and so that means that we're always seeing the same side of the moon, right? Because it rotates with us at the same rate. And so I wanted like a world that does that with the star, and there are actually a lot of planets that are like that. And so I went and read a bunch of NASA articles about stuff like that and how they can hypothesize that life could be possible on those, and just dove into that kind of concept with it. And that was part of the main inspiration for how I wanted to set up the world for it.
It's like there's a ring in the world that's habitable, and then the middle of the ring is a fiery pit of doom, and then outside is frozen wasteland.
Exactly.
So, I'd never seen that before. I found it very fascinating to read about. You kind of touched on this, but you do write very unique fantasy settings like stationary planets. So how do you come across inspirations for your world building? You mentioned you like going really deep into that. So can you talk about your process or where you find sources for that?
But with a lot of hypothetical things, I'll go and look at just whatever's random articles online. Honestly, I actually love when people just have crazy ideas, and sometimes I'll do polls with my readers, which is fun. But yeah, otherwise it's just a lot of science stuff or just random ideas that I get. I do try to consume a lot of media as well, so that might mean just fun ideas from other books or things like that, or world concepts, or just things to do with planets and the way that things work. I just love to mess around with those a little bit and hypothesize how a different world would function differently, or how certain magic concepts that I have might impact the rest of the world. And so yeah, I just throw all that together and then try to make spins on it. So sometimes I just make it up on the spot. As I have one little idea, I try to use that to just extrapolate on how the rest of the world would be impacted.
I didn't write down this question, but is there an example of something readers voted on and you wrote a story around it, or are going to write a story around it?
Yeah, so I wanted my readers to vote on the setting for the next book in a series. And so I did a poll with them, and they could choose one of 2 countries. And in my mind, I just thought, okay, well, this country, this is the dynamic that will exist there. And in this country, this is the other dynamic that will exist there. And then I want each one to be almost a different biome sort of thing. So there will be different ways that magic impacts that particular land. And I let them kind of vote, and then I get to go with some stuff that way. Other examples might be I'm going to have another one that comes up where they're going to vote on the animal companion for one of the characters, and then that might impact how that person progresses and stuff like that too.
Oh, the animal companions are always a huge hit. I can't wait to see how that turns out. You're going to have to make little stickers and stuff.
Probably.
I can see it behind you, Depths of Vanelf, in 2 very nice editions. So you mentioned that your latest book, Depths of Vanelf, meant to feel like a Dungeons and Dragons game. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that a little more, what you mean by that?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of different things about a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that are a little bit different, but I wanted to focus on 2 primary elements of that. One of those has to be with the concept of a party coming together. Because when you think about a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, you're okay, well, who's the main character? And you're there's 4 of us friends playing together. Maybe we're all the main character, right? So they all have their own skin in the game. They all have their own role they play. And so I wanted that kind of concept with it, so that each character is valued and important, and they have things they're supposed to do to progress the story and all that. The other really big concept has to do with growth, right? That's what I think makes Dungeons & Dragons so fun, is that there's this growth concept to it. This is pre-video games, right? Is what's going to make this fun? And it's the characters can level up. They can acquire gear. gear, they acquire gold, they have growth, right? So that was like the concept I want to capture is growth, whether that's by acquiring something or leveling up or something like that. And so I wanted to hit on that point a lot with it.
I think they're called like leveling stories.
Yeah, there aren't any levels in the book, but I wanted to capture that in like a narrative approach as opposed to like it's a game. I wanted it to be a narrative approach to that same kind of concept.
I was really thinking, my husband really likes lit RPG, and I'm like, it's not lit RPG, but I'm like, yeah, I think you'll like this. You should read Brady's book. Yeah. I've like added it to his Audible account. What is your background with tabletop role-playing games, TTRPGs?
Yeah, well,
like Dungeons and Dragons.
It's a little bit of a hybrid. I have played some of them, not a lot, but a lot of them are more like board game structure type things. So they have kind of like a structure to them you play. And I've only done a couple little like D&D campaigns, so not a lot of them, but I like the D&D rule structure to it. And that I love how they have, and I've done a lot of the video games. There's also a lot of video games built off of D&D rule sets, and they're like official trademarks of D&D as well. So they follow the same kind of concepts. Or like Pathfinder. I've done a little bit of Pathfinder, and it's a little different obviously, but it's kind of similar. But that's kind of like my background I've had with them. And yeah, but I guess that's kind of my background. I do a lot of board games and a few video games that are kind of based off the same rule sets and stuff like that. So yeah.
It's like the tabletop RPG to fantasy nerd. It's like a pipeline. It's like a straight pipeline. And so like we go back and forth. I kind of went backwards where I read the novelizations of Ari Salvatore and like was like, well, now I need to play the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love to hear about people, what like fantasy people, like readers and authors, their experiences with D&D, because so many of us, it's such a shared experience with so many of us.
Yeah.
So, and you kind of answered this already, but can you tell us how you work to capture like the D&D vibe and depths of Vanoff? Like anything you didn't tell us already?
Yeah, well, I did. There's another thing I did try to capture, and it had to do with the class approach. Because in D&D, it's a really big deal what kind of class you pick, because that'll impact like all the different kind of spells they can learn and what direction that character is going to go and what role they'll play in their team. And so I did that with this series as well, but there's only like 4 initial classes they can go with, and then trying not to spoil it too much, but they can go a little deeper. There can be kind of like subclasses of those 4 primary ones. And again, they have a similar thing where there's like a role to it. So the ideal party would have one of all 4 or something, right? And then it can build out from there. And when that can kind of diversify the team a little bit, and so they can work together a little better. But that was one of the big parts of it, is I wanted it to be like, hey, they depend on this role for this team to function. And so someone shouldn't be able to go and be OP all by themselves, right? They should be able to work better as a team, and that should be kind of the idea. So that was one. And then the other one was that I tried to do a little bit more of some gear type stuff and just some other things. There's a whimsical approach to D&D, I would say. Usually it's a little more lighthearted, you'll notice. Some people can do like, you can have a really depressed character and they have this super elaborate backstory, and when you get your friends together and you're having fun, they just come up with like the weirdest things. So I wanted to do some stuff like that. I put in like these weird jokes sometimes that are kind of hit and miss with the readers, but it could be something like, oh, I have a character named Bjorn, but instead of just Bjorn, like if you're going to name your fantasy character, people are always naming their characters weird things. So I named him Jason Bjorn, right? So it's like a joke. And that comes up all the time in D&D, and when you're playing with your friends, like everything can be a joke, right? I did a similar thing with the next one where there's a character named Elsa, because that's a very Scandinavian name. That's really common. And so I have a character named Elsa, and there's a scene where it's like coming up on nighttime, and she's got this like threadbare blanket, and she's like, it's okay, like the cold doesn't really bother me that much. But that's like another kind of joke on something else where that would totally happen if you're playing a game with your friends. Stuff like that would come up all the time. So just that kind of whimsical approach, or like the character, like the type of creatures they come across has a very similar aspect to that, with like how there are almost boss fights or incremental like combats and things like that they have. So yeah, lots of the vibe I tried to capture there was pretty good. Those are some of the other elements I've tried to incorporate on purpose.
This is something that like I did write a novella based on a D&D character. And I found out that there's some things that translate really well, and then there's some things that like you really have to change if you're going to try and put it into like a narrative structure. So
we have a spectator.
So what are some examples of things that like definitely have to be changed if you're going to translate it into like a narrative.
Yeah, I think anybody can make anything work if they do the right kind of approach, honestly. So I'm not going to say, hey, this is a big no-no, but there's some things to be cautious about. Like if you're playing like a D&D game with your friends, there are some things that are a little, they might deviate from the actual plot, right? Because usually if I'm forgot what they're called. Oh my gosh. If I'm the
Dungeon
Master, thank you, the DM. So if I'm the DM, I have this like idea of like where the story's going to go and what's supposed to happen within that world. And it can happen pretty easily where people deviate from that course a lot. You're going to have a much more narrow approach. So it's not so open, right? You have to stay focused. There's not many like subplots happening, or there's not many like tangential quests that might occur. You want everything to kind of tie together to the main plot. You might try and seduce the ogre or whatever, because they try to do that, but it needs to be relevant to the story. So like something like that would be like, okay, cool, this is going to have some kind of relevance to how the story's going to progress. So just kind of staying on target is important with that, because it's not so, I don't know, things need to feel important. They can't just be like a random thing. You need to feel important when people are reading a book, because you only have their attention for so long. And it's not like you can make things relevant. If they do seduce an ogre or whatever, maybe that ogre helps them in their team or helps whatever with the main quest, that something happens with that, or kind of provides some value to the plot that way. That's one thing. Otherwise, I just staying on there. That's kind of my take with it. But I know there's a lot of things that if done not well, it can be kind of weird. But again, I think if people kind of map things out properly, they can make any element fit in appropriately, depending on the voice or tone of the story too.
It's all like you have to do it with style points.
Right.
Pull it off with style points.
Yeah.
I realized that, like, I used to DM a lot, and so I realized that it was really useful in like writing final fights in fantasy to think about it as like balancing the stats. As a DM, you try to balance like the stats of the players with the stats of the boss, and you like think through like how they could potentially take out this monster. And I found that really helpful as a fantasy writer, setting up like to take out the big bad, the BBEG, as one would say. What are things like that you think do translate really well from like D&D or lessons in D&D and TTRPGs to fantasy books?
Yeah, that's great, because there does have to be this kind of progression approach to it. And this is something that video games do really well, because it's like when you first start out, everything's level 1 and you can only fight level 1 things. And then as you go to the next area, they're kind of a different level. I think being able to understand that concept, especially because it's usually very progression focused, you need to have that kind of element in place, or you need to have it come to your advantage where like this thing is so beyond them that they have to do some things before they can do that. And that's where you get things with like a story structure where it helps to have like some kind of concept of like, I call it the try-fail cycle. So if somebody tries something and they fail, then that can be like, if someone's trying to achieve the main goal, if like, oh, we need to beat this level 20 boss. It's like, okay, well, that's going to take some effort, you know. A lot of times that might result in like people just dying. If they go do it in a D&D campaign, they could just straight up die. You don't want to have that happen in the story. You have to figure some other way to make that resolve. I think that if you have that as like the objective, then the readers know like, oh, there's this big bad thing. They're nowhere close to being able to beat that. So I know that there's this big gap to fill. And it kind of helps. That's what's cool about lit RPG stuff, is you can see there's that gap, and they should know like, wow, that's a big space to fill. It'd be really hard to make that happen. So how are they going to achieve that? And so that adds this kind of element of like difficulty to it, which you see in narrative approaches too, where it's not so much as like a level gap. It's just like, wow, this is impossible. The odds are 1 in 100 for this to even be successful. And that you'll see that in all kind of fantasy, where it's like, hey, the odds need to not be in their favor, so that when they do achieve it, it gives more of a dopamine hit, right? But I think that kind of concept being applied to these is pretty big, and you'll see that a lot, because if it is a video game, they can just go farm forever and they can just level up on level 1 rats, right? They'll still get some experience, but like you want to avoid that kind of stuff in the story approach, because that's not exciting, right? Nobody likes the grind. So you want to avoid like grind aspects, because that comes in games and stuff like that a little bit, where they're grinding or they're just earning money or something like that. But it needs to equate to something and be interesting. So you don't have any grind in a book approach. It's going to be more like, this is hard always, and there's something I need to get past always, right? Or it's like, if it was easy, then that's indicative of something bigger, you know? But anyway, that's kind of like some thoughts I've had about that, because I talked about the growth aspect being important, but like showing the level of the obstacle becomes important as well. So there should be more that you can expect out of them because of the impending obstacles, I guess.
I think you can only get away with that in like lit RPG, where it's like, we're going to go kill slimes for 20 years. I don't think people tolerate that in any other genre, and even then you have to make it more interesting. I was going to ask about how you think collaborative storytelling can help people become better author. I would be interested to hear about, sounds like you also use collaborative storytelling a little bit with your audience, like at least letting them vote on where they want to set the story. Do you have any thoughts on the collaborative storytelling aspect of D&D? Or that's how I think of it, is a collaborative storytelling game.
Okay. I do less of that. I try to incorporate a little bit because, like you said, like a lot of times if you have a D&D campaign, then people are dictating a lot of what happens for that. And a DM might have a general idea of like, hey, this is the overarching plot. But the characters are going to say, well, I want to go here, or I want to talk to that guy, or I want to do this, right? I try to put that, I wanted to capture that a little bit too. And that's why I wanted like people to vote on how things happen. And there's been a lot. One of them was like voting on names. So I had people vote on names a lot. Like as I was drafting the first book, I had a lot of people submit names. But I think that kind of stuff is really cool because it helps you see what people are interested in and what they find fun. Also, what's cool behind that too is that I think it helps generate an audience as well. So that if you're interacting with them in that way, then the audience has some more input on things, and that makes it a little more fun and makes it more of an exploration for them too, because they can kind of participate in the world and the creation process. I did something similar for a lot of the art actually, because I feel like my brain can only do so much sometimes. And so I've literally hired artists and been like, hey, I want you to just create a creature for me and I'll put it in the book. So I did that for a couple pieces. I did the Kickstarter for the first book, and one of the tiers was that if they bought that tier, then that reader would work with me to create some kind of monster for the series as well. And so I actually did some stuff like that to incorporate it, and they'll be in book 2. I did all that stuff to kind of make it so like, hey, this is what's going to be in book 2. So they kind of help build that world. It adds more flavor than I would have been able to think of by myself. For instance, one of the concepts somebody introduced was an elemental, and I hadn't even thought of putting elementals in because it's like a deeper concept. When you get into like D&D rules when it comes to elementals, things are very complex sometimes, and so getting that inside the story as well, I don't know, it just adds a lot more flavor. And I think it made me kind of expand my own reach to be a little bit more. I think it just gives us the opportunity to, pretty much extrapolate on our own capacity and add more to it, which I need. I think it's fun to kind of see input from people.
I do remember seeing a whole bunch of polls you were putting out, and I was thinking, well, that's really cool. That's a cool idea. Oh, I love polls. I do usually do polls for like my titles for my books.
I saw that actually.
Yes. Yes. I'm like, I give up. You all name it. But do you have any advice or words of warning for people who are aspiring authors who might want to write books about their D&D characters?
Yeah, this comes up a lot too. Here's this kind of folly I think that people get into with it a lot, is that I think what helps is knowing when to start the story for them, right? Because a lot of times they focus on like this interesting backstory stuff and then like how to initiate a plot with a person. So even when we do any kind of character sheet, right, there's all kinds of details we could put in about that person. But sometimes that story, the best place to start that story might not be where you initially think it is. And so when it comes to a narrative approach, it's like, okay, well, how is this person's growth going to fit in with the overall plot? And because growth is a really, really important part of a character, and you really want to hit on a point where they're growing the most. That tends to be what's interesting. Focusing on that part of it, I think, is really important, because you could say, oh, I used to be an assassin and now I'm a bartender. It's like, cool. Well, let's explore that. Maybe this should start right when they become a bartender, and then maybe their previous life keeps dragging them back into something else, right? Whatever it is. Or it could be something where they were a bartender, now they're assassins. So it's like, what got them on that path? Like, why did things change? Anyway, I just think about that when it comes to like backstory and stuff like that, because I like to have fun with making a really deep character sometimes when it comes to developing a D&D character. But then also, especially if you're talking about class, because there's that whole class approach, and I know, again, it's a big deal. How does that impact the world, right? So it's like, okay, they're a cleric, but like, okay, but what does that mean? You might have to then consider how religion impacts the world and how that impacts the way that other people view that person. I think doing a good conflict list is another appropriate thing whenever it comes to a character. So think of your world, think of your character, and then all the things that might conflict with that person. It could be a conflict with themselves, which should always be present. It should be a conflict with the politics or something. It could be conflict with family. It could be a conflict with a girlfriend or something like that. There could be all kinds of things that come into play. So I think just developing it so that that person is dynamic as well, and that they can interact pretty fully with the rest of the world.
I think that's really good advice, set the story when there's the most character growth. I think that's probably a really great piece of advice that would help a lot of people.
That's a folly of mine, and it's something I try to focus on because I do that all the time where I create the character and then I'm like, dang it, but I should have maybe written the book for them at this point.
I really like that. I may tell other people that. This is what Brady Hunsaker says. That's the end of my questions. We kind of zipped through those.
I know, sorry.
But it's fine. Where can people find you online? And do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to tell us about?
Good question. So I'm on pretty much everything. I'm mostly on TikTok, honestly. TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, for whatever reason, has blown up a lot. But those are the places I'm most active. I do also do stuff on YouTube. I'm on Threads, but mostly TikTok, I guess. But I'm probably easier to interact with on Instagram, and just because I feel like it keeps track of things a little better on there. But yeah, I have my own website. I've got a few projects in the works. I have another book coming out in 2 weeks, actually. It's book 2 of this series. So this is called Dragon's Bane.
Oh.
The second book comes out in a couple weeks. It's just a duology. It's a YA. The other series, Depths of Vanoth, that we've been talking about, that's actually an adult fantasy. So all my other stuff has been YA, but this one is a YA. It's just kind of fun. And the final book is coming out. It's just the 2 books as I was kind of finding my audience. That's pretty fun. But the Depths of Vanoth series is kind of like the active project that I'm working on a lot. It's going to be about 6 books, and I'm going to publish 2 books a year is the idea until it's all done. So there's a lot going on with that. But again, the idea is that it's very interactive, and I love to kind of like poll people and do surveys and things like that. And it's a lot of fun. I spent a lot of time working on that one and building the world there, and lots of special projects around that series, I guess.
So I'm very excited to see what happens next with that.
And I'm trying to be pretty big on the audiobooks. So, and I know that's a big topic right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, lots of fun.